Now that we're done epoxying all the surfaces, we're going to continue with the epoxy process by moving on to the control horns. So we're going to epoxy in all our control horns that go on the surfaces and actually move the surface back and forth. But before we do that, we are going to locate all the openings in our surfaces and cut them out using a soldering iron. The idea behind this being that the soldering iron will just kind of melt away the plastic, and the heat will help to further adhere the covering to the wood, rather than using a X-Acto knife where you just cut it out and it could be a little bit loose and peel away. With the control horns, it's not as big of a deal because you're going to put epoxy on those, secure it down. But when we do the servo openings, we'll do the same thing. Okay, so we're going to start with the rudder, and on the rudder here, the two slots are located near the very bottom of the rudder, close to the hinge line. So you'll just kind of rub your fingers around till you find them. You can kind of indent them in with your fingernail or some kind of screwdriver or something like that. And then again, you're just going to follow this contour just real quickly. Oops. Try not to burn the rest of the plane. Just follow the contour just like that. And then we'll move on to all the other surfaces. Okay, so on the 50cc Extra, it appears they've actually pre-soldered out the two holes that you'll be using. There is a third slot here that you will not use. On some planes, there's 3 slots because you have 2 servo options. And one of them works better with the hidden servo, and one of them works better with the flush mount servo. However, it appears to me on this plane, both of them are set up for these 2 slots. So the hidden servo lines up right with this, and since the arm is going to be traveling in this direction, that's the one you'd want to use. It's most in line. And then on the flush mount option here, I can kind of feel the hole. Your servo would mount right about here. And you want your servo arm, when it's at full deflection, when it's seeing its greatest forces put upon it, you want it to be perpendicular to the hinge line, which is what we're seeing here. Now, if we had gone, and when it's relaxed like this, it's at an angle, but it's seeing the least forces on it in this position. It sees more force when the wind's blowing against it when you have full deflection. Now, if you've gone over here, what you're going to see is that it's at a slight angle going out. It's a little weaker than at the perpendicular deflection here. So this is the one that we want for either installation in this plane. However, it's important to understand and know where and why these arms should line up. So on my plane here, again, it looks like they've pre-soldered these slots out for you. But typically, this is where they're going to be located on your elevators. It's very close to the fuselage, just behind the hinge line. So if they're not marked on your plane, or on a different plane and you're watching this video for instructional purposes, you can just kind of feel where they're at like we did before on the rudder, melt them out, and you're ready to go. Okay, so now we're going to begin to glue the horns into the slots we just cut out. A couple considerations before we begin this process though. One, you want to sand the surface of these horns where they're going to enter the plane so that they grab the epoxy a little better. Just a little extra insurance that later on down the road they're not going to come out. The second consideration is that you may have to trim these tabs down. These are for the rudder, and you can see that I trimmed one section off. The reason is that on the rudder, one goes on this side and one goes on the opposite side. And when left the full length, they butted up against each other and did not allow them to be flush. So the other thing you may run into is when you put these on the elevator or the ailerons, you might find that you push these in when they have the full length that they come from the factory, and they may be pushing on the covering. So you want to make sure you trim these if they're not fitting flush or pushing through covering or pushing each other out. So make sure you dry fit everything before you begin this process. After you've done that, you want to make sure that you glue these in with the horns facing in over the hinge. What's really important when you're lining up these hinges so you get proper geometry on your rudder throws is that this hinge is pretty close to over the center of the hinge line. That'll give you even throw both directions. So again, make sure they're pointing in. Grab your epoxy gun if you have one, or your mixed epoxy, and just put some into the slot here. I've already pre-cut some paper towels and have the alcohol ready because you want to be ready to clean up right after you start this process. And it's as simple as this, just a little epoxy, Slide them in only after you've tested and dry fit. And then just for aesthetics, it's not really a whole lot that gets on these. These are a little easier than the hinges, but you may want to grab a little alcohol and just clean up any excess, especially on the outside of the hinge. I don't really worry about what's in between the two parallels. Another nice touch with RedwingRC is that, as you can see, we paint our control horns on our planes to match the color of the plane, so they're not this ugly phenolic color just sticking out of your plane everywhere. That's a nice touch that only RedwingRC does. Okay guys, so we'll move on to all the other surfaces just as before. Put in a little bit of epoxy into the slot. Put the horns in towards the hinge line, and then clean up any excess that you have. You're going to take the GT Power Portable Battery Charger from RedwingRC.com and your battery, hopefully a RedwingRC battery as well. This is one of our